Nations Trust Bank Private Banking is the epitome of elite banking. With its exclusive privileges devoted to providing just the right balance between financial success and lifestyle, our private banking members richly deserve. A financial solution dedicated to excellence, with an unparalleled array of products and services that enrich, enhance, and empower success. A financial solution focused on wealth creation, lifestyle, and the establishment of legacy. A legacy of priority, a legacy of abundance, a legacy much desired. Creating a legacy that's timeless.
Don't make a first impression or lasting impression without it. Don't trade law school for life school without it. Don't turn your house into a home without it. Don't share a moment while sharing a moment without it. Don't go abroad. Go live. Or go just a little out of your comfort zone without it. Don't change the game, or even change the world without it. And don't watch your dance like nobody's watching without it. Whatever you do, don't forget that the more you live forward, the more you need someone at your back. The powerful backing of American Express. Don't live life without it.
And Rukshan is speaking to you live from the WNPS office. So it's great that we have, you can see the famous or favorite, I would say, pangolin in the background there with Rukshan. And hopefully we'll have Rukshan soon audible and take over. Rukshan, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Sriyan. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I won't take up any more time before I launch into this presentation. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you're listening. Because we live in these strange times with this pandemic, I thought I'll put a presentation together that actually looks at how wildlife and conservation and wildlife tourism and Sri Lanka's wildlife resource is coping with this current pandemic. COVID-19 definitely has opened up new opportunities in terms of how we can and should be doing conservation, though it has seriously affected many people's livelihoods, and certainly wildlife tourism has taken one of the greatest hits since tourism or ecotourism or wildlife tourism has become a specialized branch of tourism within Sri Lanka. So okay, so ecotourism, increasing numbers to increase revenue. This is an inherently unsustainable premise, and Sri Lanka has been doing this for a while now without too much thought to where we are headed. So just to give you an idea of the statistics, so from 2008, that is just 1 year or under 1 year before the war in Sri Lanka, the civil war, the war in the north, or the separatist conflict ended. However you like to characterize it, it affected many parts of the country. especially dry zone districts in the north and the east, and further inland. So it had a direct impact on tourism, and how tourism could be done in this country. It was quite inhibiting to anybody wanting to do anything with wildlife tourism in the country other than in a few districts. So you can see what happens when the war ends. 1,000% increase from 2008 in park visitation to 2018. Actually, there's a small mistake here. So 2008 to 2018. So in 2008, it was 43,368 visitors. And in 2018, 629,246. But governments have felt that they just need to keep increasing these numbers, and the people in wildlife tourism within the corporate sector have also played along. And really, that formula was a recipe for disaster. So overcrowding in national park, for instance, like Yala, is not something new. This is really a photograph taken from about that time, approximately 2008, 2009. And you can see the vehicles were all, used Land Rovers, converted to use in tourism, wildlife tourism. They had smaller capacities than the vehicles used today, but nevertheless, they would carry many people into the park individually, but these vehicle numbers were set to increase. But even here, this is at a leopard sighting. So I will talk a lot about leopards and leopard sightings and leopard-centric tourism and how it affects all of wildlife tourism. There is good and bad about the popularity of the leopard in Sri Lanka. And it all depends on how we manage this. It is a resource, it is a necessary animal within our ecosystem. And if we handle things right, we have a new opportunity with COVID-19 to reassess how we do tourism in this country. This is a photograph taken many years later. As you can see, the type of vehicles have changed, and they are now, have a bigger capacity, more seats, forward facing. And this is once again at a leopard sighting. Earlier was at a leopard on a tree, so what we call a tree sighting. And this one is the same. And this is on the main road of Yala, and there's a long line. I mean, I don't know how many vehicles were there. Certainly more than 30 or 40. And I'm the driver looking back and taking a photograph as I move out of this mess, actually. It was orderly because there was some discipline being imposed. Otherwise, these people will be all over this road. And when a roadblock forms, then wildlife department personnel tend to get down and move the traffic around. I'll say something more about that later. So just two vehicles, mine and another one, managed to leave the area, and I didn't really want to spend time in that long line and get into that mix. So people tend to open doors and stand out. They will, once again, a fairly orderly line. In fact, I have very few photographs of chaos within the national park. That's because I tend to avoid those situations. And how those things build up is when a leopard is sighted, especially a leopard or a bear, phones are used and phone calls are made, and it kind of exponentially the number of people who know about the sighting grows, and they actually speed to that location. I think some of this, to some of you, none of this is new. To some of you, this may be new, but this is the way we do tourism in Sri Lanka. Wildlife tourism is kind of an out of control sector. If you're really in the national parks, in other protected areas, and you see how wildlife tourism actually takes place on the ground, especially when there is something interesting to see and everybody wants to see it, it's a bit it's quite chaotic. So if national parks are tourism driven, when tourism collapses, do national parks get neglected? I would think that has happened to a great extent because we prioritize tourism over ecological conservation or biodiversity conservation or looking at how we can sustain this resource, because this is a resource that is essential for the ecological health of this island. Whether it's the diversity of animals out there, the balance of the natural balance that exists, because there is a natural balance that exists at all times as long as human interference and human intervention is absent, because everything gets sorted out in nature and evened out, and often invariably the party that upsets this natural balance is us humans, and we either upset it because we are motivated to see wildlife or manage that resource in some way so that we can experience wildlife more or make money from wildlife, or we have sometimes a mistaken kind of a need to do things in an interventionist fashion that is well meant, but in the long term harmful. So let me refer to those things again later. So speeding in wildlife areas kills wildlife. That's fairly obvious. And it is something that should strike anybody, that speeding is dangerous to the animals that live within those wildlife areas, because usually they don't have to deal with traffic. They don't have to deal with traffic on a 24-hour basis. Neither do they have to deal with traffic other than in highly visited parks. So if there is and they seem to never really get used to the speed that vehicles travel through the park, because often these speeds are not speeds that animals encounter in life. If they are predators, then they will use speed to bring down another animal. If they are the prey, they will have to use speed to get away from that predator. But something that speeds along a road like a vehicle, that is contact with that vehicle is fatal to almost any animal. Perhaps only elephants would survive such an impact. So these impacts do happen, and the wildlife department has not made enough effort to put a stop to speeding. But the key to putting a stop to speeding is to restrict phone use, or at least response to phone calls. So there is a mechanism that can be put in place. The phone signals from the various towers can be switched off during certain hours. This has been proposed. This was trialed out about 5 years ago, and without much research or monitoring whether it was working or not, it was just put aside, saying it doesn't work because there's a lot of vested interest in these phone calls and this phone communication system being in place, and that vested interest is entrenched in the wildlife department, in the tourism sector, the less organized tourism sector, or jeep drive organizations, as well as the well-organized, sophisticated, educated corporate sector that is in wildlife tourism. So all these stakeholders don't want a change in the status quo, but meanwhile, animals pay a huge price. So that's a blue-faced markhor dead on the road. rhodoviara, and that's for those who haven't seen what the living bird actually looks like. That is a green bee eater, dead, just actually 2 weeks ago, and it had just been knocked down. So to hit these birds, you have to be traveling at a fair speed. Some of them fly low to the ground, some of them actually settle on the ground and fly up, but I really don't see how you can hit any of these birds, any bird, if you're careful and if you're keeping to the speeds that you're supposed to do in a national park. This is a dead deer, recently killed once again, in the small tank in which actually joins cinnamon wild. This is some years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and it was obviously an accident victim, and perhaps it got knocked into the tank because it was quite close to the embankment, which has a road on it, or it had been tossed in there. So these things happen everywhere. The entire area is a wildlife area. So speeding anywhere from the time you turn off in Yala at the Kirin junction is hazardous to wildlife. So wildlife custodians need to lead by example. So the wildlife department is also often found speeding through the parks within wildlife areas. I don't know whether they believe that somehow animals know that it's authorities who are custodial of wildlife coming along and they don't get harmed by those vehicles. Invariably, I think there are wildlife department vehicles must be running over wildlife at the speeds they do. And so if they're going to enforce these rules and regulations, they have to do it by example. There are no emergencies that you need to rush through a national park at a high speed for, unless there is somebody critically ill or some other emergency. I mean, the type of emergencies that came around during the war years don't exist either. So it's just habit. They've just got used to it. So that is where they find it very difficult to enforce these rules, because somebody can just point a finger at them and say, you do the same thing and you run the same risks. And deer, leopards, bears, just about anything you can name has been knocked down and killed or run over, including a crocodile. That's to my knowledge. But most of these things are swept under the carpet, literally hidden away, hiked into the bushes. And the wildlife department has almost a policy where these things, they don't like these things going out because it's trouble for them. But the attitude is wrong. They should try to stop it, reduce it, rather than shoot the messenger or hunt down whistleblowers or people who give this information outside. And long may those people prosper who give information about what the wildlife department does wrong, because if they are going to close ranks when they do things wrong, then there should be people who see that that is wrong and that a wider public should know. And public pressure often is the only way that behavioral change comes about within the government sector. So out of vehicles, and these are vehicles with people who work for the wildlife department, trackers, whatever. So they don't seem to have much of a problem with these situations. They're more out of vehicles. He went off the road, picked up some thorn bushes, and then came back on. And then he couldn't proceed further because it was making a big racket. But right in the middle of an elephant sighting. So his vehicle is stopped there, blocking the animals from coming onto the road and blocking the people behind from moving on. So that is the sighting, and that is basically what he was doing in the middle of it. And these elephants are milling around. So if you watch animals and you understand behavior, you realize that when you do these things, you know how animals react. So if you need to move on or move aside, animals who are on the roadside will show you that you need to. So this group has clumped together in a defensive way, and they have young with them, and the young are also right in the center. And all they want to do is come onto the road and maybe cross onto the other side, and everybody will have a better view. But no, they build a wall of vehicles and prevent them from coming out. And this happens over and over and over again. And these things have to be seen as being inherently critically wrong. These need to be fixed. And the wildlife department often is not very successful in changing this behavior. So once again, quite simply, vehicles lined up on the road. Elephant wants to come onto the road, and he has his foot raised. And I have several frames, and he just kept his foot raised, almost like indicating his wish to come onto the road, but they were right in his path. So capacity building within the DWC and FD, Forest Department, to face current and future challenges. So what are the current challenges? All these things I'm showing are current challenges, but with COVID-19 as well, we don't know what the future challenges would be. So building the department up, I mean, I cannot see too much money being voted from the Treasury for the Wildlife Department in these times. But with whatever budgetary vote they have, they need to take stock of where they are, because here is a time when the tourism pressure is not upon them, and they always say that they have under capacity to deal with tourism as well as conservation, patrolling, infrastructure maintenance, etc., etc. But now the tourism part is almost absent, so they can concentrate, redeploy their men in all these other areas and make sure that all the areas that have been neglected for a long time are up to scratch when, well, more or less normalcy returns. But I think we are all dealing with a new normal. So whether things will ever go back to the way they were is doubtful. But many things in the wildlife sector should not go back to the way they were, because they are not the good old days, they're just the bad old days. Because in the absence of a long-term study of the impact of tourism on animals like leopards and bears, and perhaps on elephants too, we can only speculate, could only speculate. But now in a very short space of time, when the parks have closed during the worst part of the early COVID, well, you could say emergency, so 3.5 months, parks closed, they reopened, and only a trickle of visitors went back to the parks, naturally, because everybody's lives have been disrupted as well. And the COVID situation is always in flux, and it's never kind of, it's quite unpredictable. So tourism has taken a kind of a hit that it hasn't had to deal with in well over 10 years. Perhaps in the height of the war, there were days like this, and there were very short periods where this Yala was closed and Wilpattu was closed for longer. But now there is a time to reassess or press the reset button on everything and start from scratch and do a better kind of wildlife tourism or ecotourism than we have been doing so far. So habituation, you can't underestimate the role of habituation or the repeated kind of exposure of an animal to human presence or benign human presence, and thereby that animal gets used to the fact that human beings are not necessarily something to worry about or feel threatened by. So they, once they get used to human presence, they just go about their normal activities, daily activities in a normal fashion. So this is a leopard that grew up in the national park. From a very young age, he was habituated, got used to people, because a few people very carefully exposed him to their presence. And after a while, he got used to it and let him approach the vehicles rather than approach him. And I can say something about this animal. Till recently, he had not been identified accurately as a cub, but he was a cub that grew up in a part of the park where, as an adult, he claimed a territory, and he was called Hamu, for people who know. Earlier, he was called Baba or whatever, and he had 7 spots under a right eye, which a wound disfigured that part of the face, and that scar altered those spots. So spot pattern identification sometimes can go wrong if you don't have identified more than one area, and that one area actually the spots can change, and in this case they did change. But there are other issues with leopards in crowded parks, and inbreeding and not leaving the natal area and trying to establish a territory within that area is a problem. But habituation means that more people can see that leopard, and some leopards become ambassadors for their species, and hundreds and thousands of people see that one leopard because he's not afraid to come out into the open or walk among vehicles, or if it's a female, she will bring her cubs into the presence of humans, and that actually can alter the perception of the general public about these animals and go beyond the myths and the fear people have of a apex predator. So this is in Vilpattu, that's in Yala. This is, once again, animal like a leopard will prefer to come onto the road behind a vehicle rather than in front, especially if it's not very accustomed to vehicles. And so this is just a quick sequence to show that a leopard sitting in the grass in Vilpattu gets up, walks, crosses the road, walks in front of these vehicles, sits down, gets up again, approaches, that's in my direction, then crosses the road, and it's actually defecating there. They do that for many reasons, not just because they need to go. But next to my vehicle is this other vehicle, and so these two vehicles now form a bit of a barrier for this leopard. So it goes in and comes onto the roads and some other place. So that's a kind of barrier. In this case, that was Vilpattu, this is Yala. One vehicle facing this leopard, or the leopard is backing both vehicles. One is facing him, one is backing him. But if the leopard were to walk the other way, he will not walk between these two vehicles. So that was the situation created in Vilpattu, and that is why the leopard left the road. In this case, these vehicles stayed stationary. If the leopard turned around and started walking towards them, then they need to create a gap. So these things might seem obvious or subtle or whatever, but they almost never happen. And animals are driven off the road when they want to walk on the road. They are kept off the road when they want to come onto the road, because game trails are blocked, physically blocked by these large vehicles, and people are waiting for the animal to come along this game trail, and he's not going to come along the game trail and jump into the vehicle. So you really need to move and give them space. So my one message would be to give them more space, give them their space, and they will give you the kind of sighting that you really would love to have. So this animal then scent marks and then walks right up to where I am, because I'm stationary. If he's moving towards me, I'm never going to move towards him. So all I will do is move backwards if he needs more space. So competitive wildlife photography can be ecologically damaging and counterproductive. How does that happen? Because everyone wants to get the shot, and everyone wants to get a better shot, and they want to upload it on Facebook or wherever, on Instagram. They want to upload it then and there from the park. And so there is a competition to get good shots, to get better shots. So phone calls are relied on, and speeding is not an issue. And However it is, if you get yourself into a position to take that photograph, for some people, that's all that matters. But that's not all that matters. Sustaining this resource is important. So you have to be ethical. There are standards that one has to adhere to. If you're a photographer, there's a responsibility. I have heard photographers saying that different countries have different ethical standards, so that's all very flexible. I don't agree. It's not flexible. I want to see a day when there are stringent rules and regulations that apply to wildlife photographers as much as to wildlife viewers, but perhaps more for photographers because they tend to have a greater drive to get close to wildlife, to do things that can be hazardous sometimes to them and hazardous to wildlife. And when no one's looking, who knows what anybody can be doing. And there are things that currently wildlife photographers are doing in the national parks which need to stop. So I'm not going to go into details about that. I do know what they do, but I think it's time that they take stock of what they're doing, because it's not going to be like Christmas all the time. And now it's a good time for wildlife photographers who are motivated because there isn't too much competition, there aren't many visitors. So once again, it's the competition when there are crowds that causes the actual damage, and the damage is maybe not easily quantifiable, but it is long-term damage. If you're speeding, your speed not only kills wildlife, it deposits dust on either side of the jeep, the gravel road, because that gravel produces a lot of dust, and coats the leaves, and also inhibits herbivores from eating those leaves. So they come to within 10 meters of the road, and then do not spend much time in the last 10 meters, the proximal part of that vegetation. And if they cross over to the other side, they go in 10 meters before they start feeding. So really everyone loses out. Animals lose out, and people who go to see them lose out. So this is once again an old photograph. So a bit of overcrowding, a bit of chaos. Everybody is everywhere. No one can really move. 3 leopards are involved, mother and 2 cubs, and they're waiting for them to come onto the road. But, well, guess what? They didn't. Feeding animals within protected areas can have drastic consequences. There's a lot of feeding of animals within protected areas. Yala, Horton Plains, perhaps Wilpattu too. I have seen the behavior. If I see the behavior of certain animals, I do know that they have been fed, because they come up to the vehicle and they're practically begging for something. It can be a peacock, it could be a mongoose, it could be a jungle fowl, it could even be a leopard. And certainly elephants and tuskers were fed in the past. Some of those tuskers are now tuskless. So the problem for the elephant and the people has been solved in a natural way. But these animals then become problem animals. They depend on human food. They look for it. They are not going to die if you don't feed them, but they're also going to get some of the diseases that we get because we feed them things that are not necessarily good for them, not natural, processed foods, bread, whatever, cheese, who knows, whatever's at hand, fruits that don't grow in our forests or don't even grow in our country. I heard that the elephant called Gamunu was fed a bag of apples by somebody one day, and I was told where he was fed that as well. And then everybody screams and shouts when he puts his head in the past at least, into vehicles looking for food. So you get them used to food that they are not used to in the forest. They don't have it naturally. They will come looking for it, and they will come into your areas and put their heads into your vehicles, into your quarters, into your hotel rooms maybe. And an elephant looking for human food and pestering humans is a mega problem. So finally, when lawmakers are lawbreakers, what do you do? So lawmakers are those in parliament, But are they all doing the right thing and living by the laws of the land? Not at all. So we know there is criminality in politics, and political interference in the departments of wildlife and forests is a real problem. There is no easy way to solve that. But saying there is political interference and political pressure on department personnel is not a cop-out for not doing your duty. You have to do your duty as much as you can in the areas that you have duties to do in whatever rank you are in a department. Then you should do that job to the best of your ability, not just be there to mark time and get your salary and finally get your pension, because there may be other more motivated people who can be in that position and do that job better than you. And so wildlife crime is something fairly enmeshed in the society, in the fabric of our society, as well as any country that has wildlife, a wildlife resource, because there's always illegal money to be made from the sale of wildlife parts, products, whatever. And wildlife in any country, and good example ours, this is a common resource. This belongs to all Sri Lankans, not just Sri Lankans who live on this island right now, but those yet to be born. So there is a duty by the current generation and population to safeguard, conserve, and hand these things over that we have inherited from our own ancestors to future generations. So the consumptive utilization of wildlife, that is, in other words, when if you're going to exhaust the resource, that is unacceptable. And often even tourism can be pushed to that point. And now with COVID-19, it is time to take stock of the way things have been happening. So the corrupt politicians are involved with elephant smuggling, baby elephants that were taken out of the wild some time ago. Now, once again, there are some more than rumors of this racket starting again. So there are private individuals, politicians, as well as people in positions of authority, officials, whether it be wildlife department officials or police department officials. There is a lot of interconnectedness in the way wildlife crime happens. Okay. So this is a slide to show what we believe is a wildlife crime. A black leopard, not the last one to die on the 28th of May, 2020, this year. This was an animal that died in about 2012 or 13 in the Deniya Hills. It died on the edge of a tea estate, caught in a snare in the same fashion as the one that died this year. It was snared deliberately, as far as one can tell, and the snarers got to the site where the leopard was caught within a few hours because they had an informant on the ground there. That is our understanding. It's okay. These brutal photographs show you that the front legs have been removed with actually surgical precision. The cuts were very sharp, and the flesh at the back of the shoulders and neck, various properties are attributed to this flesh. I don't want to go into those details. There's enough that people do know, so there is nothing really to hide about it. None of this is scientific, none of this is proven, but belief is a very strong thing. So this leopard died for just some few kilograms of his meat, not even for his skin, but meanwhile they did extract his teeth and his claws. This is where he died. Well, this is he dragged the log that the cable was attached to this cane thicket. And as you know, cane is very flexible, very strong, is thorny, but that cross piece, the log that he was dragging at the end of the cable couldn't get through this. So he just proceeded to destroy this cane thicket. So he has chewed these things. All these leaves and branches are dead because of his actions. So anyway, I need to claw marks. I'm just trying to no. Wait a minute. I've just gone out. Okay, so I wanted to show you a slide of how he scraped this tree and chewed the. Anyway, he traveled about 20 meters from where he was snared to this place, and he was killed there because there were boulders around this. So they selected a spot that he could not go beyond. They got on top of the big rocks and took sizable, liftable rocks and threw it down on him, and that's how they killed him. And those rocks were also scattered in that area, and then they dragged him out and butchered him and left the rest there. So I believe there was police complicity because the police informed the wildlife department hours later, almost more than a day later, whereas this killing and butchering had happened a long time before that. So the carcass was already quite putrefied. So these are things that really need to be addressed at a very high level and with a lot of professional help. Even the CID is not useful in these situations because I do know the CID investigating a leopard death and it went nowhere. But then again, one can't have too much faith in these government organizations anymore. As you can see in the news, many things happen that shouldn't happen. So we need more research, and the research findings need to be incorporated into conservation. So that is an area that not just the research, but research findings need to go into conservation. So the wildlife department is often resistant to using new research in conservation, which is unfortunate because they don't do enough of their own research. So researchers are independent and they are private and maybe part of a Sri Lankan NGO, or they may be individuals supported by an institute or affiliated to a university. But there has to be, just if you can give a research permit and it has been evaluated properly, then the Department of Wildlife are the research permit granting authority, then you have to be using that research because there is a time to the department. There are conditions where that research is to be necessarily shared by the department. It shouldn't be sitting gathering dust on a shelf. It should be incorporated into conservation. Otherwise, there is really no future to this resource. When you do infrastructure improvements in a park like Yala, you don't need to do massive roads like this. This is a road that is not much traveled, but they've bulldozed this to the size of the main road of Yala. This is, for those of you who know, Akasa Chaitya, this is a back road. It was a tiny road earlier, but now, because it is not such a used road, it has grown back. I haven't seen it. If I had, I would have taken a photograph. I was told that the jungle has moved from both sides and it's quite a narrow road. So really, why waste the money and the time doing stupid things when there are more important things to be done. Keep all the roads that are existing open, but don't bulldoze these roads to massive sizes and destroy all the vegetation on either side and not use it again. So animals like bear too, when they're habituated, they are very tolerant. Some individuals, they're individualistic just as much as leopards are individualistic, and some are more tolerant than others, just like we have more tolerant humans and more tolerant friends and less tolerant friends. So that's always the case. They are mammals, they are higher mammals, so there is no real uniformity among the population. There is diversity. And so one vehicle can follow like this, but if there are more, sometimes the bear will go in. This is a bear that surprised me, and I surprised him and he surprised me, because I was on a park round, came back, it was mid-morning, it was Varahana, and I just got down and just walked towards this rock, just stretched my legs, and a bear got up on it. So as I saw him getting up, I went back and got the lens out of the vehicle because it was still close by, and I took 2 shots, and then he got down and went, because he didn't expect people to be there, and it was broad, bright daylight. So why I'm putting this slide and talking about bears is they are the most, seemingly the large mammal that's most sensitive to disturbance of the environment. In many areas of the Ala, you don't see bear the way you used to. There's still some numbers in the park, but we don't really know whether there is a decline. But I speculate, and many of us think there is a decline. Everywhere in the dry zone, the sloth bear is in decline, and nothing can really be done about it until proper studies are done. And the research concludes, comes up with conclusive reasons as to why the bear is declining and what mitigatory measures and what countermeasures can be taken. So this is why I say research is terribly important. We don't even have statistical information about how many animals live in our national parks, you know, how many leopards, how many bears, how many deer, how many sambar. You go to India, you see that in some of their parks. So they are more advanced than we are. We are always often laughing at the way India does things, that many things that we can learn from them. And conservation is something we certainly can learn from them. They do better research than we do, by and large, and they apply it to conservation better than we do. So in capacity building, we don't have to go far. We can just go across to India or get people from India to come here. They'll be willing. But we have this attitude that we know it all sometimes, when we don't know anything really. And once again, there was this waterhole where there was a lot of people parked around it. So the leopard mother and son, the mother had hoisted a deer carcass in the center. So she had to necessarily go in and out through this ring of vehicles. So as a result, a lot of people got really good sightings because she's habituated, but sometimes she was also at the point of the limit of her tolerance, and she's eating the leg of this deer the second day or the third day. That's because when we arrived there was hardly anybody, and people had gone because we were inside the park, and people had to leave the park by a certain time, so they need to set off 45 minutes earlier. So introduced animals and disease. So introduced animals, dogs. Do we introduce them deliberately? No. Poachers take dogs into national parks, and they sometimes stay behind because they prefer to stay and hunt the deer or whatever. Maybe they feel that they're better fed if they hunt for themselves. So small packs sometimes form. That happens in Yala. This is in block 5. This dog has been now killed by a leopard. It's unfortunate, but the department needs to be proactive about this. This is a problem that has been highlighted over the years. The real problem here is not just that the dog is going to die sooner or later, because a leopard is going to taken interest in it, an unhealthy interest in this case, and it's dead. It's got strangulated and suffocated in the classic way a leopard kills an animal. It's another mammal. It's not the let's get this clear. Dogs are not the leopard's favorite food. Leopards and dogs don't encounter each other except in peripheral areas, outside of protected areas where the interface of human settlements and human activity in agriculture and wildlife intermingle. And there, dogs might attract leopards more than some of the other domestic animals because dogs are very vocal. And when dogs bark, that attracts leopards. And dogs tend to bark at leopards, which is a mistake. And unlike being barked, other animals that are barked at, leopards turn around and take an interest and might realize that this is a prey-sized animal and this animal can be caught. So that's the same dog with a young leopard. We are not sure whether this is the leopard that caught the dog and killed it, but she was certainly interested. But there were a lot of people there and she didn't eat any part of the dog. But there's a huge problem for the leopard eating the dog because there are two known diseases that I'm told that COVID-19 could be a problem. I'm not too sure about that. The dogs are carrying COVID-19 or what animal passes COVID-19 to what animal. Certainly mammals, mammal to mammal, possible. But there is feline enteritis. Okay, the leopard is a feline. So it can contract feline enteritis, which domestic cats often get. And if a leopard gets feline enteritis by eating a dog, not just a cat, cats are also a problem, then it can spread through the leopard population. Or you can get canine distemper. Now, canine distemper was contracted by a leopard in Kruger National Park years ago. And it was a park ranger's dog. And that dog was caught and killed by a leopard. But that dog had distemper. And I suppose they didn't know at the time, but the leopard got it. And 1/3 of the leopards of that part of Kruger died of canine distemper before they brought it under control, because they did vaccinate them, and they're far more sophisticated than we are in the way they handle a crisis. So I dread to think what would happen if our leopards get canine distemper or feline enteritis or some other unknown disease from domestic stock, and how our department is going to cope with that. So it's a, once again, common resource. So I would think some pressure needs to be brought to bear for them to do something about dogs and cats wandering through national parks. They can take drastic measures. I'm not advocating that at all. There are animal rights organizations who can, interact with them or collaborate with the wildlife department and sort this situation out. And it can be very humane and it can be a win-win for everybody, including the dogs. But if it remains like this, it's not a good thing at all. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. And there are overcrowding problems with other animals, domestic buffaloes. These are mixed. Sometimes there are domestic buffaloes mixed with wild buffaloes, and they're feral. They're all over these parks. There is an overpopulation. So you can see this elephant showing that his displeasure. He's chasing the buffaloes out of this waterhole, though they really mean no harm to him. And he's just unhappy. And then he drinks. So, and COVID means closures often, and it means long times when the park doesn't have visitors, which means the wildlife department has to be on its toes and do extra patrolling, because illegals don't follow any rules, COVID-19 or not, if they're going in and out of parks and hunting and poaching and trapping, they will continue to do it. And then animals, especially animals like leopards that are habituated, are at severe risk, because habituation means they are used to the presence of people, not necessarily the presence of people on foot, but at the rate that the wildlife department gets down from vehicles and directs traffic or gets down to fill water holes or whatever they do, there are leopards that are used to people on foot, which is a very dangerous thing to be used to, because it's not always that, you know, hostile individuals or humans also come on foot. And then when the park closed, these two leopards, I think the year was 2014 perhaps, maybe it was later than that, 14 or 16, park closed for the dry season. These two habituated cubs and the mother, I do know that the two cubs didn't survive the closure of the dry season, because they were just gone from their mother's natal area. And that's a second set of cubs in roughly the same area that I know of. 2003, a set of cubs around the same age lost their lives to poachers. And these two also can be assumed to have lost their lives to poachers. So there is a huge duty and responsibility on the part of the wildlife department, especially to protect wildlife that are used to people in national park when there are no visitors, and the only visitors are people with you know, illegal, people who come in for illegal activities, which also could mean hunting wildlife or killing anything that is available. So that's them again. So habituation once again means that there is any kind of behavior in close presence of humans. That vehicle is just 10 meters away. So that's good for tourism. That's good in every way, because these leopards also become fairly successful in a park where disturbance is not a factor. If disturbance is a factor that inhibits behavior, and if you're habituated, then you don't have a problem as a leopard going about doing your whatever your daily routine is. Despite visitors, they just ignore it, and they also become excellent ambassadors for their kind. So ecological sensitivity, ecological awareness, and intervention. So what is that I'm talking about? Ecological sensitivity is whether you're doing park management, whether you're opening, you know, areas where tourism can happen better. You do things like what's called underbrushing, where the undergrowth is removed to a certain distance from the road, so both animals have, you know, can have better grazing, as well as human beings can see in animals that come into that area. So that is something that it's a artificial modification of the environment that sometimes suits both humans and wildlife. But all these things have to be done sensitively, where you can use, you know, people on foot and, you know, just implements that are mechanical, not you know, automated like chainsaws or bulldozers or backhoes, and you can just use namates or, you know, billhook knives or other types of implements to open up a road and keep it open. That's the way you should do it. The easy option is not always the best option. So that ecological sensitivity is necessary. Whether you build a causeway or a culvert or whatever, you have to be sensitive to the way you build it. It has to be ecological, as eco-friendly as possible and functional. But I don't see much of that happening. And intervention. Okay, so this ecological sensitivity, when you do infrastructure or whatever, there's a water hole, this is concrete, you can't see it that clearly there. There you can see it like a wash basin. So photographically, as far as I'm concerned, this is a ruined shot, because you don't want leopards playing on the edge of your swimming pool or whatever that looks like your pond in your back garden. It's not your back garden. It's in the heart of a national park. It's in Block 5. This is not the way to build or do water holes. If you need concrete to prevent the water seeping into the soil, then it should be so subtle that you can't even see that it has a concrete bottom, not an edge of cement. Now, I do know who has sponsored these things. Sometimes the money is given, sometimes actual manpower. But as much as I've told these people that this is not the way to do it, it continues to happen. And I don't know, well, no photographer would want to have a sighting, a photo sighting on the edge of a concrete pond. And most people who go to the wild are sensitive enough to appreciate the natural environment, not the built environment. And so that also brings one question: how much do we intervene? Do we mitigate the drought by building dozens of water holes inside a national park in a drought-prone area so that we bring water to that area so that the grip of the drought is not there for animals in that area? Kruger National Park did that. So we can always learn from a premier African park like Kruger. For years, maybe 30, 40 years, they had windmills that brought up water from tube wells and filled artificial water holes. But they stopped it about 10 years ago. Why? Because they found that because they do long-term studies, they're always monitoring what happens, and they're monitoring changes, and they're monitoring change through time, something we do not do. So what they found is the area right around the water holes were getting hammered. Basically, all the vegetation was being overgrazed and actually crushed underfoot, and rhinos and elephants and everything was coming to drink at these small water holes, and they were coming constantly day and night, much traffic back and forth, and while they were there, they were eating everything, and there was a dead zone that was created around these water holes. So therefore, they backed off from that policy. So they took a change of direction and they stopped maintaining these water holes so that the drought does take effect. And the drought is a necessary thing. Just because there's a tourism imperative, we shouldn't try to break the grip of the drought in any part of the park. That is my belief. And if water, well, we can try to conserve water by building better tanks and better water holes or maintaining the water hole in a way that it lasts through the drought, but artificially filling is not a good idea, because then an artificial situation happens where animals that should not be there year round or not be meeting at the water hole meet, and there can be conflict and there can be worse. This is the slide that I have to show you. This is just about a month, well, under a month ago. It's last month. This leopard cub was sitting on this mound in a place called Walaswala, between Katagamu and Varahana, and it was obviously injured. It had a missing ear, as you can see. It's also got an infected ear from what we can tell, because people there said that they got a very bad smell. I didn't, but I can well imagine. She just looks in really poor shape. She's very emaciated. That's why her eyes look big and her head looks big, because her body has kind of withered. And so finally she went into a hollow tree trunk. And before that, phone calls were made and vets were called and intervention was pleaded for. And the vet closest at Lunugambhera, I think, came with a small team, and they looked for her. She was inside that tree, and somebody had looked in, and she had jumped out and run with probably the last reserves of her strength. So what they were going to do, I guess, was shoot some kind of antibiotic into her. But I think that's totally unnecessary. This is the way it is in the wild. It's hard to watch sometimes, hard to deal with if you are sensitive and compassionate towards animals, but this is nature. These are the checks and balances. This is survival of the fittest obviously she's not the fittest and she's not going to survive. So artificially, do we prop these animals up? If the animal had got caught in a snare or some other gunshot injury or something, we should intervene. But if it's not through human agency and it has happened because of internecine fighting between leopards, or if a leopard gets injured or a bear gets injured because of another animal, because trying to catch another animal, animal counterattacks, then that leopard, well, has to take its chances of surviving through whatever natural remedial processes that are there. And if it doesn't survive, it doesn't survive, because every time you prop up an animal that shouldn't survive an injury or a disease and puts it back in the wild or keeps it going in the wild, a fitter animal, an animal that really deserves to survive because of its fitness, loses opportunities with food and breeding. So that balance we upset by our well-meaning but ill thought out emotional response or intervention. So that is all I have. Thank you very much for watching and listening. I think we need to just one passing final message. So what is one of the greatest challenges faced by countries like ours is, once again, that those who make the laws are also ones who break the laws. So wildlife crime also can't be seen in isolation, because it's highly connected and interconnected. So where money can be made quickly, there will always be people willing to do that, whatever the price. These are common assets. These are no animals like leopards, bears, elephants. They are not private property. In fact, elephants are protected under the Public Property Act. So the destructive exploitation of wildlife is something that really needs to be looked at and dealt with and kind of mitigated, because Sri Lanka doesn't have a lot of land area, doesn't have a lot of forest cover, and it's dwindling all the time. And habitat loss is the biggest challenge to the survival of all species on this island. And when this island becomes uninhabitable to many other species, it will eventually become uninhabitable to us too. But I think there is a hidebound way of thinking that development must, conservation and wildlife and wilderness has to give way to development. But the two have to go hand in hand and can and should coexist, because in many countries that have taken that route of destroying their natural environment in the headlong rush to develop have reversed that policy and now are regrowing forests and doing a lot of things that are hard to do, but nature does very easily. So we can't replicate some things, and it just takes too long, and there isn't that much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukshan. And interesting perspectives. So I'm going to jump into a couple of questions. Rukshan, I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to be a bit provocative on this. I'm going to start with where you ended off. So we talk about all the lawmakers, the politicians who, so let me first start by saying that all the, comments expressed are Rukshan's personal comments, nothing to do with the society. These are his views, like all speakers when we bring them on the podium here. But while we talk about all the politicians and the people who make the laws and all the flaws they have, what about this group? The people on this call, the people who love wildlife, how good an example are we of the model that we want to follow? how many photographers here would run to the parks the moment that the park is a bit empty? How many people would rather, push the boundary to take the photograph, even though it may not be as abusive as some of what we saw? I think aren't many of us also equally to blame, and how do we stem that culture? I'm pushing back.
Are you asking me?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, well, Sriyan, if you are somebody who benefits from, if your sightings benefit from phone calls received in a national park, and if you don't get the person who's driving your vehicle to drive slowly whenever, I mean, at all times, then you're also contributing to this situation.
Exactly.
I know people, I mean, I think the time has come to name names, but today I'm not going to do it because if I start naming names, a lot of people are going to get egg on their face. There are a lot of people who ostensibly are involved in conservation or eco-sensitive who are definitely not. And so the thing is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem really now.
Yeah.
So what is the solution? Why do this work in conservation? What does conservation, being a conservationist, require? Let me just read something I wrote. So, okay, conservation requires self-sacrifice in terms of time and effort for no personal gain. For no personal gain, not a little personal gain. Bread and butter conservationists can do a limited amount, but will be restricted by their personal stake in the environment. Effective conservation needs a high level of integrity. Networking is important, collaboration is important, but if privileges, favors, or special treatment is sought or received from what is a 100% government monopoly, your effort and your result will be compromised. So that's what conservation is.
Yeah.
Conservation.
Sorry. So I was pushing back mainly because I think there is a collective role to play on both sides. And I think while we have a lot of conversations about what others could do, I think we as a society would like everybody who works with us and, all of ourselves included to try to figure out what better ways we could also contribute to this equation. So there are some interesting questions people are posing. People, for example, there was a question around the role of drones. That's the new thing, the new toy around, and the role of drones in photography and all of that is bound to increase, and that also starts becoming fairly intrusive, as we know, right? How do you see the role of drones in conservation, especially when it comes to monitoring over wildlife parks? We know in some parks these are banned, in some others it's only allowed by the authorities. How do you see that space evolving?
Yeah, I wanted to mention something that this is asked because technology and modern technology and digital technology should definitely be used in conservation, but it has to be very judiciously used for any other purpose relating to wildlife, for instance, photography. Who is a responsible person to use a drone over a national park? That's the first question to answer. And if the wildlife department is not ecologically sensitive enough, does not know the behavior of animals or how animals react to drones, does not know what the minimum height that is a safe height for a drone to be used without disturbing any of the species within that national park, they are not the responsible party to be using drones. So if there's a researcher who has experience in Africa or other parts of Asia and knows all those parameters, then that is the person who's the responsible party to be able to use a drone. Certainly not a wildlife photographer whose imperatives and objectives are not going to be right.
Okay, great. There are a couple of comments around, what could we do on overcrowding and this and that. There have been suggestions like limiting the phones. Could the number of vehicles be limited? I just want to share that, I think many of these kind of suggestions and proposals have been put at different times back to the authorities. And I think these are solutions which lots of people know about, but sometimes the commercial and other interests seems to outweigh, the right steps for conservation. Rukshan, in terms of COVID, right? So COVID is going to kind of possibly redefine tourism, where people go, in what forms people would like to be experiencing sights and sounds and locations, right? So to that extent, more exclusive, private, value-added kind of tourism will possibly end up being the flavor of the future, rather than this hordes of tourism in large numbers to the same location, right? So how do you think this might play out? Because we have two of the largest visited spots in terms of Horton and Yala, which are hugely overcrowded on the vehicle side. What do you think might happen as we go forward?
Yeah, that's why I think that this is a huge opportunity for the wildlife department and the government. The government needs to be advised on these things, especially if it's not very. None of these past governments have been very eco-sensitive or green. They don't understand green issues. They don't understand ecology or conservation or sustainability. They just bandy these words around. So if they are really interested in having a better country, a better island, better conservation, better wildlife resources, then they need to get the expertise available wherever it is. It's available locally as well, but it's available if you're unhappy thinking that local expertise has various vested interests, and you get it from outside, but you get it on a consultancy basis. You get the best knowledge available on how to manage your particular wildlife resource. So I think one of the biggest recommendations that will come will be to limit the way you give access to tourism to your sensitive ecosystems, and especially somewhere like Horton Plains National Park. I mean, these are all a dollars and cents or rupees and cents thing. Why we keep putting more and more visitors in is because more and more money comes into the treasury via these departments. So every minister that takes this job thinks that he must show really a positive uptick in the money, the gate revenue or whatever from the national park, and then show that his department is competing financially with other departments which are, more kind of dynamic and more kind of stable and more controllable in a sense. Right. So the only way these people think that is put more and more people in. But for a long time, I have felt that, even high-end, low-impact tourism in smaller numbers is the way we need to go with all of our wildlife resource. And staggering the numbers that go in is a start, but that's resisted.
Right. So, Rukshan, there's a lot of attention which gets focused on these tourist numbers and the two or three wildlife parks. But there's a lot more ecosystem out there which is getting damaged by the Sri Lankans, which is nothing to do with tourism. Massive tranches of areas being cleared for various purposes, and forests illegally taken over, marshes, etc., right? Now, again, one of the challenges with COVID is that even to be a balancing force, people are not going to be able to travel to these areas much to actually even report on these infringements, which might give the illegal parties more options, more opportunities. So on one side, we are talking of COVID being an opportunity. There is also a huge threat that COVID will result in all of us having to stay more indoors and the bad guys having a field day. How can we, are there any practical steps that we can take? Can we network together? Can we band together? What could we do to slow the tide in a COVID environment?
Yeah, I think the civilian role is limited in this environment, unfortunately. But the military plays a big role right now because of COVID-19 and trying to get a handle on, the spread of this disease. So since they are out and about in the field, the only thing I can think of is that they need to be informed and educated about what else is at risk. I mean, we can't go through a pandemic for 2 years and come out at the other end losing so much of what we had before the pandemic. So illegals will always act. It's like what they say, make hay while the sun shines. And for them, the sun is shining. COVID or no COVID, if there is less supervision and less attention on things that they want to exploit extractively, then they will do it. So once again, the civilian role in these times are limited. But within protected areas, I certainly see a new role or that the wildlife department and the forest department can do these things with renewed vigor. But what I actually see is in the small forest patches and these things that have been talked about, the other forests, the other state forests where if you look at collectively, many of them are small to tiny, and those are under severe threat. So it's almost like nobody really cares about those anymore. And so do you kind of cut your losses and safeguard the larger chunks when you can and where you can? I don't know. COVID-19 is a time of opportunity as well as a time of peril for some things. But certainly, you've got to be proactive right now. You can't be reactive, because when you react about many things that happen out there, it's too late. Like you saw how quickly they cleared that patch of mangrove. Overnight, some bulldozer driver worked from 6 hours at night or something and did vast damage. So that is the way it's going to be. But if the due process takes place when something like this is found out, and the court procedure is done properly and the FFPO is upheld, then from there on, people will think twice. And you need to do 2 or 3 cases need to be successful in terms of protection or conservation and upholding the FFPO and not making this or that an excuse, and regardless of who's involved and who's behind it. So I think that's a huge challenge for Sri Lanka because of where we are as a kind of a less developed country, or I don't know what these categories don't mean anything either anymore. I mean, less developed or more developed. What is it? New. We are not even newly industrialized. What is the latest category? I think we are being downgraded, but we are not considered a third world country anymore. Neither are we considered a developed nation. So we are in that kind of in-between stage, and we can go either way. We can go back to the economic bracket we were in, or we can get to a better, higher place. But meanwhile, while we are obsessed with the developmental aspect and the per capita income and the gross national product, we can't lose what we have inherited as an island naturally.
So on that on that tension which is between the economic growth and the conservation, which is global tension. If Sri Lanka were to move to a more high-end kind of destination, what would be the answer for employment and other aspects? What other industries do you think people could be channeled into? Because the numbers of tourism are obviously going to come down.
Yeah. So I think nature tourism can play a huge role in Sri Lanka, far more than it does now, earning far more revenue. Perhaps having even more people employed, but in different roles, not in the role that people think, traditionally. Not necessarily everybody working in the national park as a tracker, or everybody working in the town as a jeep driver, but far more sophisticated jobs that are high earning. And so if we transform our tourism, nature tourism, into a high-end operation, then all those high-end jobs also open up. And there also lies the sustainability. When there is more money, when there is less impact and the footprint is light on the environment, then your conservation goals are also successful. When you're trying to do nature tourism like they did it in 1950, and you have so much less than 1950, how is it going to succeed?
Good point. Well said. So I need to bring the session to a close. We've had some other interesting comments around, some of the parks all over the world bring YouTube videos and, broadcast live from the parks, which kind of help people be updated and experience the parks while staying at home. So these are things that, the authorities could always consider here. Other suggestions around, why don't we take the rates up and, take the visitor numbers down. So very much along the lines of what we are talking about, of moving this value chain upwards. I just want to conclude on a note to link with some of the work that we've been doing. As you know, we see a big role for the public right now, because some of the challenges we are seeing cannot be dealt by one party alone. The WNPS is powerless in many cases because we are just one voice, and there are many such voices, and we do a lot of networking. We band together with other organizations, both for conservation and for putting up a better fight. But really, it seems that the authorities and governments are much more inclined to listen to the broader public at large. And so you cannot continue to be silent and expect the societies and the different institutions to be the voice of objection. That phase, that era may be over. And it is only when the entire public can arise against something that change can happen. So I would encourage more and more of you to kind of make yourselves be heard on your Twitter accounts, on your social media, but please don't make this only about social media, because there is a much wider audience out there in the rural areas, people who are being impacted on the ground. They also need to come to the party. So in any ways that you can, if you can spread the message and create more voices who stand up for conservation, I think that's when we can expect to see some visible changes starting to happen. We can always contribute to the policymakers, the decision makers with ideas and thoughts and sessions like this, but it is a grassroots and the voices of many which will have to come together in a cacophony of harmony, which is only when, we will probably be fighting back in true form. So Rukshan, thank you very much on behalf of all the, couple of hundred people who are on this call, and I guess many more who will be on the other links that we have created to tune into this. So I hope many of you enjoyed the session. These are tough times, so firstly, please stay safe. Secondly, please respect all the rules and regulations which are coming in. These are not convenient, these are uncomfortable, but as we have seen, any one of us can cause chaos if we don't adhere to these guidelines, and the chaos cannot be put back once the genie is out of the bottle. So please stay safe. Good luck. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you guys again in a couple of weeks. We might have some interesting sessions at some odd durations based around some of our upcoming international speakers' availability. So watch out for when the next dates are. Again, many thanks to NTB and so many of our sponsors who make all this happen every day. Good luck, all the best. Thank you from WNPS.